In the bustling streets of Manila, under the suffocating heat of a typical Filipino day, two lives followed completely opposite paths. On one side, Manny Pacquiao, the national icon of the Philippines, arrived in his luxurious Mercedes with a private driver. Impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, he was heading to another official commitment as a senator of the Republic. His fingers, once marked by calluses from boxing gloves, now wore an expensive watch that reflected the capital's sunshine. The crowd gathered to glimpse the man who had won 8 world titles in different weight classes, an unprecedented feat in international boxing. At another point in the same city, under an improvised and faded umbrella, an elderly woman with grey hair and trembling hands carefully arranged mangoes, bananas, and rambutan at a small wooden stand. Mrs. Corazon Diaz, at 68, was just another anonymous street vendor among thousands in the Filipino capital. Her glasses, mended with adhesive tape, constantly slipped down her nose as she tried to calculate the day's earnings in the small worn notebook she carried. There was something in the dignity of her gestures, in the way she greeted customers with a genuine smile, that didn't reveal how much her joints ached after spending 10 hours a day in the same position. No one passing by could imagine that those same hands, now wrinkled, had once guided the first writing strokes of children who dreamed of a better future in a small school in Bukidnon province. Manila's chaotic traffic forced Pacquiao's driver to take a detour through a secondary street, where stalls of street vendors lined the narrow sidewalks. As his car slowly advanced, something caught Manny's attention through the darkened window. An elderly lady, bent over a small fruit stand, seemed vaguely familiar. There was something about her posture, the way she meticulously organized the fruits, that awakened a distant memory in his mind. Impulsively, Manny asked the driver to stop. Ignoring his assistant's protests about being late for the important meeting that awaited him, he got out of the vehicle. A few meters from the stand, a crystal-clear memory emerged. That way of arranging things in perfectly aligned rows, that same tilt of the head when counting. It was like returning to the classroom in General Santos City, where a young math teacher insisted on the importance of precision and perseverance, qualities that would later define his career in the ring. Without thinking about the cell phone cameras that began to follow him or the murmurs of the crowd that quickly formed, Manny approached the stand. The lady, absorbed in her calculations, didn't notice the growing commotion around her. When she finally looked up, her aged face first showed confusion, then a spark of recognition, and finally, disbelief. Before she could fully stand up, Manny had already stepped forward, taking her wrinkled hands in his. In the simplicity of that gesture, two lives separated by decades and radically different circumstances reconnected in seconds. That night, in his mansion in Forbes Park, Manny couldn't get the encounter with Mrs. Diaz out of his mind. Memories returned in waves, how she stayed after school hours to help him with math problems when he, a poor and hungry boy, could barely concentrate. How she shared her own lunch when she noticed he hadn't brought anything. How she had insisted that he not drop out of school even when his family could no longer afford the school uniform. As he looked out the window at Manila's twinkling lights, Manny felt a growing restlessness. The contrast between his current life and Mrs. Diaz's was painfully clear. He, who had emerged from extreme poverty to become one of the wealthiest and most influential personalities in the Philippines, couldn't reconcile the image of that dedicated teacher with that of the elderly woman selling fruits under the scorching sun. Their brief conversation revealed fragments of her life after leaving teaching: the insufficient retirement, the deceased husband, the expensive arthritis medication, the grandchildren she helped raise. For days, the image of Mrs. Diaz haunted Manny. In the midst of parliamentary sessions and official commitments, he found himself thinking about her. Between meetings, he discreetly asked his assistant to find out more about his former teacher's current situation. The information that came back only confirmed his concerns. She lived in precarious conditions, in a small apartment in Tonda, one of Manila's poorest neighborhoods, and depended entirely on her small fruit stand to survive. 2 weeks after the fortuitous encounter, Manny decided to visit the neighborhood where Mrs. Diaz lived. Without notifying his security team, he personally drove a simple car to Tonda. The contrast with his residential neighborhood couldn't be more striking. Narrow alleys where barefoot children played amid puddles of dirty water, deteriorated buildings with clothes hanging on makeshift clotheslines, the persistent smell of uncollected garbage. Following the instructions he had received, Manny arrived at a small three-story building with peeling paint. He slowly climbed the broken stairs to the third floor, where a plywood door marked the entrance to Mrs. Diaz's apartment. He hesitated momentarily before knocking, suddenly conscious of the intrusion his presence might represent. When the door opened, the sight that greeted him was even more impactful than expected. The tiny apartment, poorly lit by a single window, contained only the essentials: a twin bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and some kitchen utensils. On the peeling walls, however, was something that immediately caught his attention: photos of students, dozens of them, carefully organized on worn cork boards. And there he was, at 11 years old, holding a math certificate, his childish face beaming with pride. Mrs. Diaz, visibly embarrassed by the unexpected visit, tried hurriedly to organize the space. It was then that Manny noticed, on the table, stacks of old school notebooks, carefully preserved, and among them, a scrapbook. When Mrs. Diaz momentarily left to prepare tea in the improvised kitchen, he couldn't resist and opened the album. Inside, he found dozens of newspaper clippings documenting each of his fights, each world title, each important moment of his career. The last page contained a recent clipping about his work in the Senate. The return to his mansion that night was marked by a heavy silence. Manny dismissed his team and retreated to his private office, where he spent hours contemplating the photos he had discreetly taken of Mrs. Diaz's apartment. The discovery that she had followed his entire trajectory, proudly collecting each achievement as if it were her own, provoked a deep reflection. In the following days, Manny cancelled various commitments, citing health problems. In reality, he was going through an inner transformation. He revisited memories of his poor childhood in General Santos City, of how he sold cigarettes on the streets to help support his family, of how he slept in cardboard boxes when he ran away from home at 14 to try a boxing career in Manila, and of how, amid so much adversity, a few adults, like Mrs. Diaz, had believed in his potential. During this period of introspection, Manny realized that, despite all his philanthropy, the houses he built for typhoon victims, the scholarships he funded, the hospitals he helped maintain, there was something impersonal about his donations. He contributed money but maintained emotional distance from the beneficiaries. His wealth and status had created an invisible barrier between him and ordinary people, people like Mrs. Diaz, who had truly impacted his life. This realization led him to a decision. It wouldn't be enough to simply send money or buy a house for his former teacher. That would solve her material problems, but would do little to truly honor the impact she had on his life. Something more meaningful was needed, something that publicly recognized the value of teachers like her, who worked tirelessly in the shadows, shaping the future of a nation. In the following weeks, Manny worked quietly on his plan. He met with architects, lawyers, and education specialists. He visited sites in General Santos City, his hometown, and carefully analyzed budget proposals. In parallel, his research team discreetly located former students of Mrs. Diaz, doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs, public employees, who had been touched by her dedicated work. While preparations advanced, Manny maintained regular contact with Mrs. Diaz, visiting her whenever possible, bringing small gifts and, more importantly, listening to her stories. He rediscovered the simple pleasure of hearing her life lessons, now no longer as a student, but as a friend. He noticed how, despite financial difficulties, she maintained the same passion for teaching, frequently helping neighborhood children with homework without charging anything. One morning, Manny invited Mrs. Diaz to accompany him on a visit to General Santos City, claiming they would participate in a charity event. She reluctantly accepted, concerned about her fruit stand and about the plane trip, something she had never experienced. Manny assured her that everything would be taken care of, including her small business, which would continue to operate under an assistant's supervision during her absence. On the day of the trip, a private car picked up Mrs. Diaz at her apartment. To her surprise, when they arrived at the airport, there were no reporters or crowds, just a private jet waiting on the runway. Throughout the journey, Manny maintained an air of mystery about the true purpose of the trip, skillfully deflecting his guests' questions with stories of his childhood in General Santos. When they landed in General Santos City, a small entourage awaited them. Instead of heading to the city center, they went to a peripheral neighborhood, where an extensive property surrounded by trees housed a newly completed construction. As they approached, Mrs. Diaz could distinguish a modern educational complex, with various buildings harmoniously distributed throughout the wooded space. At the main entrance, a crowd was waiting. Students in impeccable uniforms formed two lines, creating a human corridor. Teachers in formal attire held banners. Local authorities and the press were strategically positioned. The driver stopped the car in front of a large plaque covered by a cloth. When Mrs. Diaz got out of the vehicle, she was greeted by an explosion of applause. Confused and emotional, she clung to Manny's arm, who gently guided her through the corridor of students. As they advanced, familiar faces began to appear in the crowd. Former students, now adults, some traveling from far away to be present at that moment. When they reached the covered plaque, Manny gave a signal and the cloth was removed, revealing the words, "Professor Corazon Diaz Educational Institute, where small dreams become great achievements." For a moment, Mrs. Diaz remained motionless, unable to process what she saw. Then, her eyes filled with tears as Manny explained that the complex, consisting of a primary school, secondary school, library, science laboratories, and vocational training center, had been built in her honor to continue her legacy of transforming lives through education. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Manny revealed that the institute would be managed by a foundation whose board would be chaired by Mrs. Diaz herself, who would receive not only a substantial salary as emeritus director, but also a comfortable house on the school grounds. The complex would offer free education for children from low-income families, with special emphasis on sports and arts, as well as food and health programs. 6 months after the inauguration, the Professor Corazon Diaz Educational Institute had become a model of educational excellence in the Philippines. The constant presence of Mrs. Diaz, now with renewed health and unwavering energy, inspired both students and teachers. Her small office, decorated with memories of more than 4 decades of teaching, became a pilgrimage point for educators from all over the country. Manny, in turn, found a new purpose for his political influence. Inspired by the project in General Santos, he proposed a comprehensive reform of the Filipino teachers' retirement system and launched a national program of recognition and support for educators. His regular visits to the institute, always discreet and without prior announcements, became his refuge from the pressures of public life. During one of these visits, Manny found Mrs. Diaz in her private garden, teaching a small group of children about medicinal plants. Observing from a distance, he noticed how the little one's eyes shone with the same admiration that he himself had felt decades ago. There was a continuity there, a cycle of knowledge and gratitude that transcended generations. When Mrs. Diaz spotted him and smiled, Manny understood that his greatest victory had not been in the ring or in politics, but in that simple moment of human reconnection. The Institute was not just a gesture of charity or an attempt to pay off a debt from the past. It was an affirmation of the fundamental truth that had guided his journey since the days when he sold cigarettes on the streets, that no success has meaning if it is not shared, that no wealth has value if it does not serve to elevate others. That afternoon, as they walked through the corridors of the Institute, now filled with children's laughter and infinite possibilities, a silent certainty united them, that even in the most unlikely success stories, it is the small acts of kindness that truly shape destinies, and that the greatest honor is not in receiving applause, but in being able to help others find their own voice in the world. If you like this kind of story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next videos.